Hey, fellow passengers, it's Mimi again. And my most sincere hope is that by now, maybe you find that I'm growing on you. You know, like a fungus. Because you know what they say. Falling in love is like eating mushrooms. You never know if it's the real thing until it's too late. But today, it's for sure too late for you because you will fall in love with my guest, Dr. Michael Beug. Dr. Beug, if you don't know who he is, you may be familiar with some of his proteges, including the very famous Paul Stamets, Jonathan Ott, and Jeremy Bigwood, just to name a few, all of whom studied under Dr. Beug. Dr. Beug taught chemistry, mycology, and organic farming at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington for 32 years. He's retired now, but that hasn't slowed him down at all. And as you will hear, Dr. Beug has had a very interesting career, the likes of which we could all hope to even, sort of scratch the surface of. And I really can't wait for you to hear some of those stories from his life and his career. But I thought it was going to be really cool to talk with Dr. Beug today because, first of all, he's a personal hero. He's written several books, including Ascomycete Fungi of North America and the more recent and incredibly wonderful Mushrooms of Cascadia. Fungi are so critical to the work that we do in agriculture. They synthesize like a truly limitless array of secondary metabolites, including lots of antibiotics, lots of cancer treatments, lots of modern drugs depend exclusively on their mycological origins. And they also have played a role in basically the great phylogenetic tree of life since it crept out of the ocean. So we touch on all of those things and more today. And I was so excited to speak with Dr. Beug, and he was very generous with his time. You will hear he's very passionate about basically the intersection between fungi and chemistry and agriculture and the moment that we're in, this little pickle that we find ourselves in the modern age. And he vacillates between moments of pure pessimism and, some hopeful notes too. So I hope you enjoy this, my interview with Dr. Michael Beug. And without further delay, let's just get right to it.
Today's episode is brought to you by Real Organic Project. Does your farm deserve to be recognized for all the hard work done on behalf of the environment and your community? Real Organic Project is an add-on certification that partners with 1,000 plus certified organic farms across North America, including my own farm, Rough Draft Farmstead. Available at no cost to farmers and with minimal time commitment, it is a great way to differentiate your farm from mass-marketed corporate organic, where hydroponic production and animal confinement are still commonplace. Real Organic Project is a whole farm certification program to distinguish crops grown in healthy soils and livestock raised humanely on pasture. As a farmer-led movement, we know many hands make for quick work. I hope you will lend yours by signing up for Real Organic Project certification today. Visit realorganicproject.org/no-till to apply. That's realorganicproject.org/no-till to apply. Today's episode is also brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. All right, enjoy the show.
Hello, Dr. Beug. Thank you so much for being with me today.
My pleasure.
It's really nice to meet you in person. I've been a fan of yours for a really long time.
Well, it's good to hear.
When I was in graduate school, I took a mycology course. I was in forest biology, and had a copy of your Ascomycete Fungi of North America and just fell in love with the taxonomy of mushrooms, which is just still such a...
Who was your professor?
His name was Efren, and his last name is going to escape me. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And he was a big fan of yours too.
Yeah, we've been friends for a long time.
Yeah, he was quite an excellent professor as well. I'm embarrassed that I temporarily forgot his name there, of course. Well,
I do that all the time.
It always happens when you're on the spot too, because that just makes me seem like a forgetful Nelly. Well, Dr. Beug, thank you again for being with me today. And if you would, I'm a big fan, and of course, I've already talked about your illustrious career, but could you orient our listeners to who you are, where you live, and a little brief history of how you got to be who you are?
Well, how I got to be who I am is just a series of accidental things that have happened, starting back in 7th grade when I won a blueberry pie eating contest and the mushroom. But I've been growing plants, when I was a kid, I mean, real little, like 5 years old, I had to pick strawberries to have enough money to have shoes and clothes to wear to school. And we always gardened and foraged. So there's a long history there of growing things and that being an important part of my life. Mushrooms played no part of my life till graduate school when somebody gave me a bag of morels, and they were so delicious because I don't like store-bought mushrooms. And I didn't even pay attention to the existence of mushrooms before that, other than stomping puffballs when I was a kid.
Everybody's favorite.
And now I live in the heart of the Columbia River Gorge, about 8 miles due north of Oregon. So basically, it's just an incredibly beautiful place. I've got 32 and a half acres with 2 acres of vineyard, 2 acres of orchard, a huge garden, about 24 acres of beautiful oak and fir woodlands. And so I found a lot of new species, even some sitting where I'm sitting right here and just looking out my window. I have windows that point to the north and to the west.
Incredible.
And yeah, so it's a beautiful place. And we've been here for 20 years now, after 32 years teaching at Evergreen State College in Olympia.
Well, you've done so many things in your career and you've mentored so many people. It's really just such a treat to get to speak with you today. And, one of the things that you really sort of pushed forward is the taxonomy of mushrooms and mushroom identification with your books and your teaching. And for me, taxonomy was kind of like the ultimate gateway drug into a passion for science and biology in particular. How do you feel your work in taxonomy and mushroom identification has been a bridge in your work, if it has? And how do you think taxonomy and classification supports scientific discovery?
Well, when somebody brought me that bag of morels back in the summer of 1968, the very first West Coast mushroom clubs were just forming. The only book we had for mushroom identification on the West Coast was Margaret McKinney's The Savory Wild Mushroom. And right away, then when I joined Evergreen State College, Margaret McKinney had lived in Olympia, had just passed away a few years before, but she had set up a tradition of a mushroom show with the Audubon Society. And that brought in Dr. Alexander Smith from the University of Michigan, who was then the leading North American mycologist, and this woman from Idaho, who was a college professor in English that fell in love with mushrooms under Dr. Smith's tutelage, specifically became a romaria, a coral expert. And I was working with 5 or 6 students. I knew virtually nothing about mushrooms, but they wanted to learn about mushrooms as entheogens, well, we didn't even have that term yet. That was coined by my students 5 years later. But they were interested in ethnomycology. And I said, okay, I don't know much, but we'll learn it together. And we showed up at the show and we're helping out. And then Kit took me under her wings. And then when it turned out we had a scanning electron microscope at Evergreen, and Alex didn't have access to such a machine at the University of Michigan, he started coming out regularly and working with Paul Stamets once Paul showed up in 1975. And I just sort of got thrown in, and right away was invited to join a group called the Pacific Northwest Key Council to create ways of identifying the mushrooms of the Northwest. And Kit and I naively decided that we would write a book that would help us identify all of the mushrooms in the Northwest. And we, some 10,000 species. Had no idea how complex it was. And, the first publisher we sent it to loved the book. They held on to it for 4 or 5 years and finally said they couldn't afford to publish it because we were demanding a lot of color. And then 3 more publishers in a row all said they wanted to do it. And the next thing I knew, David Aurora came out with Mushrooms Demystified.
Oh,
And Kit and I, we'd been working on our book by that time for about 7 years. And he just didn't have very much color. And that's how he was able to get it published. And so we sent all of our photographs to Gary Linkoff, who was then writing the first Audubon Field Guide. And our photographs went into that book instead of our own book. And I swore I would never write another book about mushrooms. And the ascomycete, I only agreed to write that in 2012 because there were 3 mycologists, and I thought I'd just be a fourth wheel and be a good way to learn about ascos. I didn't realize what role I'd wind up playing in creating that book. And my co-authors didn't realize what I would want to write versus what they'd planned. A little book about ascos. I'd planned the most comprehensive book I could write.
it's a wonderful book.
So anyway, that's the long story.
I did not realize, I had never heard, obviously, that story about, this book that never happened. I mean, what happened to all of that work that you did?
Well, I gave all of the text material to Dr. Daniel Stuntz and later Joe Amorati at the University of Washington. They used it in their courses.
Wow.
And the mushroom photos were almost all published in the Audubon Field Guide.
Right.
And I felt that I really liked David Aurora's book. I hated his keys, but I liked the book itself. And I saw no reason to try and compete with it.
Wow. What? Wow.
But I learned a lot. That was the important part.
I love your attitude.
Drug me in.
That's such a great attitude to have. So what was it about, that early exposure to a bag of morels and about fungi that has fueled your extremely prolific career? Was it just the lack of information that there was about mushrooms and how much there was to learn, or was there something more to it?
It was the lack of information. We knew very little about toxicology. And since I had a doctorate in chemistry, I got sucked into the toxicology deeply right away because I was learning to identify mushrooms, but I also understood the chemistry of the poisonous ones and could interpret that. My doctorate had been written on enzyme kinetics. So
cool. Very cool.
It was quite appropriate. It fit very well with the study of mushrooms.
And you ended up at Evergreen, which I think is in a lot of ways is just a gateway to a totally different kind of career because of how open and flexible that program is. But talk a little bit about how you ended up at Evergreen.
Well, first of all, I decided early on, like in the 7th or 8th grade, I was never, ever going to be a teacher. And even up to 3 months before getting my doctorate, I still knew I was never, ever going to be a teacher. But I had written this paper about this enzyme carbonic anhydrase that I was working on, which was believed to be inhibited by DDT and therefore causing eggshell thinning. And as a last second project before I could finish my doctorate, I had to go take a quick look at it for my thesis advisor. I said, no, it's not inhibited. And I had no idea what I had done, but suddenly I'm the hero of industry. And I was so furious because all I had done is I had put a line in the paper that it's not the carbonate transport that's inhibited, it's the calcium transport. But the reviewers made me take that out because that was speculation. And then also a part I've never really talked about, I wrote to this guy, Peekall, who was the leading ornithologist at the time in New York. And I said, you need to investigate the calcium transport. And he wrote back thanking my thesis professor for the information.
Wow.
And I got chewed out for that because for giving him information and helping his research. And so I decided I didn't want to be a university professor or go into industry. I canceled all my industry interviews, and I was the only white male that had any interviews out of the 50 students. And I called up my undergraduate thesis advisor, which was Harvey Mudd, and he was going on sabbatical that fall. And on that phone call, he gave me I got an assistant professorship at Evergreen at Harvey Mudd College.
Unbelievable.
But within 2 months, they had offered me a tenure track position, not just a visiting position, so I could stay at Harvey Mudd. And I told them I would stay until Evergreen offered me a job. And Evergreen didn't answer my letters, so we flew up and I interviewed. And they said, have 2 students write and 2 professors. And what I didn't know is the entire freshman class wrote letters.
Oh,
and I didn't hear back from Evergreen and didn't hear back from Evergreen. And it was April. They'd hired another Harvey Mudd chemist who'd been teaching at Reed and did the same research I did. So I knew they wouldn't hire me. But I went into the dean at Harvey Mudd and asked for a raise because I was making under $10,000 a year and we couldn't afford a place with air conditioning.
Especially there.
And he said no. And I said, well, I quit. I walked out of my office and the department chairman was walking out of his office to find me to tell me that Evergreen was on the phone. I was the 25th hire out of 10,000 applicants.
You just can't make this stuff up.
I had no idea what Evergreen was. I applied because I like to fish for steelhead. I like to pick up crabs at low tide and hunt mushrooms and ski. No clue what this college, but it was a small college. That's what appealed to me. And it was new. That appealed to me. And then when I got there, the Evergreen ornithologist, of course, was waiting to kill me. I mean, literally kill me over the DDT. And I told him how angry I had been. And we planned this program called the Ecology and Chemistry of Pollution. And we said, to do it right, it's got to be 2 years long and got to include the summers year round. In fact, no other program in the history of the college has been more than 3 quarters. So we taught it 8 quarters and we needed 1 extra quarter to wrap it up. But we researched the effects of DDT on a Douglas fir tussock moth thing in Northeast Oregon. And DDT had been banned by Ruckelshaus in 1972, but Congress was going to overturn that ban unless this big DDT spray happened. And the then head of the EPA flew out with the lead NBC reporter to see our research and tried to get the DDT spray stopped and couldn't. He actually flew back a second time in the spring to give us a couple $100,000 and a big chunk of land set aside that wouldn't be sprayed so we could compare the effects. And the paper that we wrote on that led to the final banning of DDT because Congress had said, and it was Republicans and Democrats alike said, you either approve this DDT spray or we eliminate the EPA, which was then only 2 years old. It had been formed by Richard Nixon.
Right. It's such an incredible story.
So, but our lives were being threatened. Our jobs were being threatened. I had prominent senators from the South and elsewhere trying to get both of us fired, with the state of Hawaii trying to get us fired. And the Republican Governor Dan Evans, what became our protector, and later became president of Evergreen State College.
Oh my goodness. So many, it's kind of unbelievable, really, all the things that have happened in your life and in your career. And so much of it, just to hear you tell it sounds, like just a series of random events, but it's just crazy to think that you were a part of all of these kind of monumental, very pivotal moments and things that I care very deeply about, at least, and I know our listeners do too. That particular outbreak of the tussock moth in Douglas fir was such a big deal out here. And I don't think people recognize that was the end of DDT. I think they think about, Silent Spring and Rachel Carson and obviously that kind of got the ball rolling, but that you had such a role in that final ending, even though you also were on the other side of that. And, do you look back on that and marvel about it, or do you think it speaks to a particular time or just your own particular brand of luck?
Yeah, I don't know. I hadn't been aware of Rachel Carson and the 1962 publication of Silent Spring until 1972, when all of this blew up. And then I started reading up on her. But I was a great believer that DDT was causing eggshell thinning. I was just clearing up how it was happening.
Yeah.
And it was how industry twisted my work. And I had also submitted that original paper to the journal Biochemistry. And the then head of that journal, a Nobel laureate, said, "This is so important, it's got to be in Science." And I'd submitted the paper to Science, and they rejected it. And 2 months later, my exact paper appeared in Science with somebody else's name on it.
Oh,
and it was stolen by researchers in Florida. And so I was involved with a couple more Nobel laureates to try and set the record straight. And all Science did is publish my original paper under my name. And then people were wondering why I was publishing something that had already been published. But Science didn't offer any explanation. They just published my paper.
It's really, you really can't make this stuff up. It's really unbelievable. And I don't want to derail us too much because I'm going to divert just for a moment. But when you, I don't know if you've seen there was a recent article in the New York Times sort of, I guess, calling out some of the liberties taken with the concept of, the Wood Wide Web and some of Suzanne Simard's work and, the underground networks and how trees communicate with each other. And it reminded me when I was reading that of some of the things that you had shared with me from your career. And I think there's this, this intersection between basic science and media, and then how things get interpreted in popular culture, that starts to feel like science is at war, when in fact it's really just the way science makes it into mainstream. Do you have any reflections on that from, just what you just shared, and then also, the DDT stuff where you were on both sides of it?
Well, like I say, I was always only on one side of it, but I was portrayed as on
your
both
work,
sides.
Yeah.
Yeah, my work was portrayed that way. And but there are scientists that lack integrity and get highly paid. I was up against one of those in when I was testifying for the U.S. Senate committees, and he was saying, well, he would eat a spoonful of DDT just to show how harmless it was. And I offered him a martini to go with it because that would kill him because it's so insoluble.
Yeah.
It's not that it's safe for humans. It's just that we don't absorb it.
Right. Get a little alcohol in there, though.
Yeah, get a little alcohol in there. So I thought I could do a good deed by giving him a nice drink, and he knew exactly what would happen.
Hey, let me help you wash that down.
Yeah. Anyway, and there are those people out there. They're very, very much a minority in science. And almost every week, I subscribe to the journal Science, and almost every week there's an article by the current editor-in-chief, who's very much a man after my own heart, about those few people on the fringe that try and misrepresent, for example, COVID and treatments for COVID, and misrepresent everything from A to Z for personal profit, fame, and money. And I had always felt science is above it, and most of us are, but not all.
Well, and just the idea that science would be a place to, I guess, push forward a cult of personality. I think that's one of my criticisms anymore. It's just that it's a way of personal brand building that seems shameful, but I won't divert us anymore from that. Right. The important topics and the important work. So this podcast, as I shared with you, is largely for farmers who are oriented towards regenerative and no-till practices. What we're calling regenerative now, it's really just a very holistic way of working the land. And I would love it if you would just speak a little bit about what you think land managers and farmers in particular would benefit from knowing about fungi.
Well, probably the most important part, I'm busy reading Sheldon's book, The Entangled Life, right now, and I'm about halfway through it. And it's all stuff that I've been aware of and been following. But he talks about the importance. Right now, we're breeding plants primarily for a strong resistance to herbicides, so we can spray with herbicides. We're breeding them for a strong response to added nitrogen and phosphorus and stuff. But there is a small fringe group that's been around actually for 40 years now, but is growing in importance, where people are saying we need to be breeding plants that are promiscuous with fungi that form mycorrhizal relationships with a wide variety of fungi. And also, they discovered we can breed fungi to be more promiscuous in the number of and kinds of different plants that they form mycorrhizae with. Because all life on Earth evolved from when algae blew up on the shores,
crept out of the ocean,
and fungi were there, but the fungi needed the algae for their photosynthetic ability. The algae had no roots, and so that interaction led to the development eventually of plants with roots and later plants with flowers and everything we know today. It switched us from a very, very high CO2 atmosphere with almost no oxygen to a very high oxygen atmosphere. So this mycorrhizal relationship is so central to our very, very existence. All of life evolved from these mycorrhizae, and it's time to turn back and pay attention to it. And that's probably the most important thing that I would add. I mean, there's these grazing techniques that a lot of people are using now that I think are fantastic, where you have a large pasture and you subdivide it into small subsections, and you graze a section heavily, and then you move your animals off that to the next section, and then the next, and then the next. And they find that greatly increases the productivity of the land. But also, way back in around 1980, there was a graduate student from Switzerland working at Paul Stamets' farm, looking at mycorrhizal interactions with the plants that he was growing in his garden, with the garden plants. Plus, he had other Evergreen graduates and others that were working on, when he was done growing out his blocks of oyster mushrooms, putting those along the lower edge of a pasture to intercept water flowing into the streams and into the and eat the E. coli and other problems, and also to enrich the soil. So there's the mycoremediation stuff, to literally eat a lot of these toxic chemicals, to eat oil pollution. It's tough. It doesn't work easily, but it's quite exciting. It's hard to make your living that way. I do have one of my former students tried it. He's doing agriculture now. I mean, he's growing hazelnut trees, which we tend in the Northwest to call filberts, up in Canada, that are blight resistant, because right now we've got a blight wiping out our filbert orchards.
Yeah.
And filbert is a major crop. And also they're trying to get those switched over to be called hazelnuts, because nobody except people around here know what a filbert is.
Yep.
And hazelnuts are, so there's these interesting issues of branding, but I've been growing things since I was about 4 years old, and when I was little, it was essential. But even in graduate school, we didn't have much money. And so foraging for mushrooms and having a garden has been a part of my life ever since my wife and I got married, because her family background is very similar. They had to have a big garden in order to survive. And so we've both been gardening. Now it's just me. She's not up to being out and helping, but it's still an important part. In fact, I just harvested the last of the lettuce. I grow this special heat-tolerant lettuce in the summertime, and I finished the harvest yesterday, because we've opened the gates, and now that we got 5 deer in, and they'd eaten all my cabbages that I would hope would overwinter.
The gophers have just been getting to mine just as they were getting perfect.
Yeah, well, I have a smaller gopher problem. The only thing that got eaten was one of my medicinal marijuana plants that I grow to help my wife, and they ate all the roots.
Oh dear!
The thing just keeled over, and so that was a bit of a loss. But
I bet there are people who can help you out with that.
Well, I'm not worried about it.
I know. It's always nice to have your own plants, though. It's such a beautiful plant to grow. Yeah. Well, I think that sort of leads to my next question, which is, if you were going to advise or counsel a landowner or land manager who wanted to do a better job of encouraging fungal populations, beneficial fungal populations, are there resources or techniques that you would point them to that to be particularly good?
I'm really not aware of, other than taking a good sustainable agriculture class like the sustainable agriculture program that I used to teach in at Evergreen State College. Mm-hmm. So I actually taught that way more often than I only taught mycology 3 times.
I know, that's crazy.
And the rest of the time I was either teaching chemistry or energy systems or environmental design, but most often as possible, I was teaching sustainable agriculture. So you really need a good soil science background from a good soil scientist, typically small school. There's the people that feel that applying chemicals is just fine. But I really believe in composting and compost production and large scale compost production.
Yeah.
And carefully done. So
compost is amazing. And it really, especially if you're making, either various different kinds of compost that have higher cellulose content. I've found, very, very strong relationships to, beneficial fungi populations when you are incorporating a lot of woody debris or just composting for longer periods of time, and leaf mulch and things like that, I think work really well. And one of the things that you said really struck me, because I think about this a lot. I have a side obsession with the origins of life on Earth, and specifically that sort of first great extinction event, where oxygen was liberated and, became the dominant gas in our atmosphere. And I think most people don't appreciate, certainly we don't encourage, I think at very young ages, this sort of curiosity about the millions and billions of years that were spent on just these most basic relationships that made everything that came after possible. And if we just appreciated those a little bit more, I think we'd be a lot more careful with all of our practices, but specifically our agricultural practices.
I hate to say what I'm going to go ahead and say it. It's just probably way too depressing for most people.
It's okay. They hear a lot of that here.
We are looking for ways to grow crops that are more heat tolerant, that can survive, and a lot of crops are going to grow better with a higher CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. But that higher CO2 concentration in the atmosphere means a higher dissolved CO2 concentration in the oceans. And what's happening right now is we're on the front of a collapse of ocean ecosystems because of this acidification that could cause a total collapse of the phyto and zooplankton. And all we're going to wind up left in the ocean growing successfully is some viruses, bacteria, and jellyfish. The fish are going to be gone. And that's a bit of a problem. But within 20 years, if we don't curb our CO2 emissions, and this is where I get ready. A lot of people say, well, we don't have to curb the CO2. We just have to figure out a way to make our cities more resilient to the heat. How do we make the oceans more resilient to the acidification caused by the dissolved CO2? Because what's happening is the coral reefs are dissolving, the shell forming critters, the clams, and a wide range of things that develop that need to be able to form a shell. We're going to lose those, but when we lose those, we lose our oxygen.
Yep.
And that could happen probably not within my lifetime, because I'm very close to 80 years old. But it could happen by the time you're middle-aged, unless we change. And that's actually the most important thing, more important than the regenerative agriculture, which is very important to me. But our answer has to be, how do we fix more CO2? How do we get it out? Now, one of the ways you do that is through mycorrhizal fungi. So there is a role for agriculture, and but we've got to start building up the soil organic carbon as a first priority to get that CO2 out of the atmosphere. Because if we don't, we're going to lose our oxygen. So it's not a small problem, and it's definitely within the lifetime of my children and my grandchildren. And the overpopulation. Right now, I've forgotten the exact figures, but if we count the biomass of humans and the biomass of all of our animals, our domestic animals, that's 90% of the domestic biomass of animal biomass on Earth. We've left no space for the wild. And the implications there are more zoonotic diseases and more problems like COVID.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Tilth Soil.
This Cleveland, Ohio-based company is producing some of the highest quality potting mixes out there. One of the biggest lessons I learned in farming is the importance of good seed starting mixes, and that's why I included Tilth Soil in my book and have been using their seed starting mix, Sprout, on my farm since 2020. Tilth Soil produces potting mixes approved for use in organic operations like our own. Their living soil is made with fully composted food waste they collect and process themselves. Whether you need a cubic yard super sack once a year or ongoing deliveries for your year-round operation, Tilth has you covered. The team at Tilth can help with shipping, coordination, and provide ongoing support throughout the growing season. To learn more, visit www.tilthsoil.com. That's tilthsoil.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. Johnny's Selected Seeds is a proud sponsor of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. Since 1973, Johnny's has supported farmers and gardeners with superior seeds, tools, and information to help ensure their growing success and help feed their communities and families. The research farm is at the heart of Johnny's, where they trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Their breeding program uniquely focuses on introducing varieties that meet the needs or solve the challenges mixed market, small farmers, and avid gardeners face. Visit johnnyseeds.com for innovative new varieties and time-tested favorites to grow this season. You can also browse their online growers library, link in the description, for a wealth of free educational resources. The employee owners at Johnny's look forward to growing with you. All right, back to the show.
So talking about agricultural soils and just sort of the presence or absence of beneficial fungi, I have definitely observed that in a lot of agro ecosystems, they've just shifted away from fungal populations and are largely, bacterially dominated. Even if they have a lot of diversity, it tends to be more bacterial diversity. And, one of the things that I like to talk about is the sort of critical role of mycorrhizal fungi in forming soil aggregates and that relationship between soil aggregation and the rehydration of our soils, which has a lot to do with building, sort of resilient communities. Do you have thoughts about, how to start taking this more seriously in terms of just, the critical role of fungi and how to encourage fungi on, what's a fairly vast amount of privately held land now, just to be able to kind of put that in front of farmers as a management goal.
I wished I felt good about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen a huge difference where I live in the gorge, where we first bought this property in 1979, and we could not find an organic farmer or anyone concerned about sustainable agriculture anywhere in the gorge back then. Now the movement is strong, but it's still a very small minority of the total population. And it's considered an expensive fringe activity. And it is more expensive as a way of going ahead. But if you had to pay the full cost of using petroleum, the full cost of burning coal, the emissions from a coal plant alone cause so much damage to downwind forest ecosystems that it exceeds the value of the power generated by the coal plant alone. And that doesn't even talk about the erosion of metal infrastructure, the decomposition of concrete, and the decomposition of human lungs from what's coming out of those coal plants. There's no price put on those things. So we're not paying anywhere near the price of our petroleum economy and of our coal economy. I have inherited oil mineral rights in Texas. Very, very small share, not worth a lot of money, but I have looked at the taxes around that. I get paid for allowing people to pump that oil and get a tax deduction. Now I'm talking about my income in the last 10 years has averaged $35 a year. I mean, we're not
still.
But there was a short period when my youngest was in college that we had enough income that by him living at home and going to an inexpensive college, not a fancy private college, the income just for those 4 years, and the income lasted 4 years. It exactly matched his 4 years in college, and it covered his costs.
Wow.
But pretty soon, in 4 years, those 5 wells that we had a tiny share in each were pumped dry because it was an old oil field, that had been some ancestor's ancestor, had inherited this land, and then it gets subdivided into all the descendants. And so we have a very tiny piece of what's actually a lot of money per well, but not for very long. So one thing I learned is how brief the productive period of a well is. And then in visiting oil land in Oklahoma and California, seeing how much damage the wells do to the surrounding environment, how much damage they do to the air quality, none of which is paid for. It's all subsidized to keep oil cheap, artificially cheap. But because it's cheap, we're wasteful. We use too much. We blow through it too fast. So we have this tax structure then that mitigates against conservation, and doesn't pay the full cost of what we're doing. Where the full cost of solar power, people see right up front, we have to pay it. But it's way cheaper than petroleum power of any kind.
So is photosynthesis.
But we don't have enough of the rare earth metals to provide solar power to the current global population. So even once we start switching to this solar, and this is where my energy system part of my life kicks in, there's going to be this huge migration attempt from the people who can't get solar power because we can't produce enough batteries, we can't produce enough solar. The critical things that are part of the solar power production that are in limited resources are some of these metals, these rare earth metals. We simply have too many people even for solar power to save us. But it's better.
Well, and certainly it would be better if we didn't continue to hold up a false economy that literally incentivizes all of our worst behaviors and provides a stiff penalty for anything that is at odds with that model. So I hear you saying you're pessimistic, and I feel that for sure. And yet I think, for our listeners who have sort of already been on the path of, regenerative practices, one of the things that I think gets left out of our discourse around, sustainable agriculture and regenerative practices a lot of times is the critical nature of habitat and the role of habitat in agriculture ecosystems. I apologize for that noise. I'm not even really sure what it is, but hopefully my amazing editors will be able to deal with that.
I can't hear it.
Oh, good. That's great. Anyway, I think, when I was studying forest ecosystems, the reason I came back to agriculture was because I saw that no matter what kind of, mycorrhizal inoculant you might apply, or, the limited tillage or whatever we do, there is a piece of it that we miss when we overlook the critical nature of connected habitats. Do you have anything to say about that and how important it is for even having productive agriculture.
I think you're right on. This business of connected habitats is critical. And that's the other reason I worry about the population, because with the increasing population, our habitats are becoming increasingly disconnected. And so until we change those attitudes,
yeah,
and there's a lot of people out there that are trying to change them, but there's also this rapidly growing movement of people who deny it all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the scary part.
Yeah.
And the real scary part is the majority of those folks are rural. That is, the people that are owning large pieces of land. I don't want to alienate them, but I sure would like to see them moving in a direction of sustainability, because I think it will in the long run be more affordable than what we're doing.
Absolutely. And, you know, another thing that I think we often overlook is just the connection between proximity to healthy habitat and our mental health. This may be a great time to, you know, dip our toe in the water of psychedelics, but I mean, I think there's a lot. In fact, I'd say 99.9% of my conversations end up in this place where we don't need a lot more research on how to fix our problems. We need to fix people's minds. We need to change the way that we think. And of course, you have done a lot of work in this area. What are your thoughts about the current sort of leading edge of psychedelics and human health, and especially mental health? And, you know, do you have any reflections on how that might actually help in this particular struggle?
Well,
it's totally okay if you don't.
Oh, no, I do. I have very strong feelings there. I have used the mushrooms to experience them one time.
Wow. One time.
One time. And it changed me profoundly and permanently. And it was 30 years before I recognized how it had changed me. But it made me way more empathetic, way more caring about others than before that one time. I don't feel a personal need to do it again. My church is in the old growth forests. My cathedral is one particular piece of old growth forest in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, where I go to reflect and think about the future, think about what I can contribute to make it better. And we're seeing these people talking about psilocybin as a gateway drug. It's actually exactly and precisely the opposite of a gateway drug. Or if we call it a gateway drug, what it is a gateway towards is spirituality, caring, away from the very dangerous drugs like heroin and all of the opioids. It's the way out of that conundrum. It's not the path into it. And I see county after county in Oregon. We're not seeing it in Washington yet because we don't have any law that would allow people ever to use it. But the rural counties of Oregon are widely banning these clinics where you can go and experience these mushrooms under a controlled setting. I'm not a fan of recreational use of these mushrooms. There are people that'll do it, but most of them do it, you know, the ones that I know, it's something once or twice a year. It's not something like alcohol where it's once or twice or thrice or fourth a day.
Right.
It's an incredibly safe drug. It has no known LD50, lethal dose in 50% of the population. If it did, I'd be dead because I'm not sensitive to these mushrooms. It took a lot to affect me. And I spent 10 years studying them before I tried them once. So I prepared very, very carefully. And if I hadn't, I think the outcome would have been very different than what happened. I was not expecting it to make me empathetic. My students had coined the term entheogens, but I hadn't paid a lot of attention to it. But now I do. And there was an article in Fungi magazine about 10 years ago now about using, actually less than 10 years, about 7 years ago, about using these things in churches. And there is a church or two that does. And they don't have to actually use the mushrooms right away. They just need to prepare people mentally for it. But I think we can move towards a much more caring society. And when you have a 70% cure rate for PTSD, a 70% reduction in spousal abuse, amazing cure rate for people who are trying to quit smoking, people who are trying to quit alcohol, and then calling these a Schedule 1 drug, which means that they have no medical use, when this is probably the single most important medicinal mushroom for dealing with the mind. There's nothing like it. I know when Michael Pollan was writing How to Change Your Mind, we had he would call me up and we'd have long talks and we'd gone out to dinner together. And my interest is really in psilocybin more than the others because A, it's natural. B, it lasts half as long as LSD, doesn't have the flashback problems. And so I'm hoping we pass a law in Washington similar to Oregon. I'm hoping Oregon manages to go ahead with the law in a way that it spreads, and that it spreads the caring that I think can be spread by these mushrooms. But setting is important. Playing around with them can be dangerous.
And we definitely don't want to sound as though we are recommending that anybody go out and just personally endeavor to discover psychedelic mushrooms based on this podcast. I completely agree. But one of the things that I think is so powerful about your experience is that, I also have, some control issues. And so experiencing or experimenting with psychedelics was never something that appealed to me just because I was afraid of what might happen. But I think that, having had personally experiences in nature that have literally changed me forever, for the better, what you describe as your experience with mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, I think is, you can see examples of when people have had that one encounter, that one experience, whether it's in nature or with a mentor or with, a psychedelic drug, that it really can shift the trajectory of your life permanently and for the better. And I think that one of the poisons about how we live now is that people have to overcome so many obstacles to have that experience, whether it's in nature or with psychedelics.
When I did my one use of them, it was at Brighton Bush, the end of October, in an old growth forest at a hallucinogenic mushroom conference. Richard Alpert, who was the Harvard psychologist who quit and took on the name Ram Dass, which meant servant of God. These mushrooms converted him from a non-practicing Jew to a deeply religious man. He was present. Terence McKenna was speaking.
Wow.
And my mentor, Kit Skates, wanted to know what these mushrooms were like. My students for 10 years have been telling me I had to quit talking about the mushrooms when I'd never tried them. I was also with the then president of the North American Mycological Association and the secretary of the EMA, and a safety observer. So there were 4 of us that did the mushrooms together with an observer. But everyone was there. Paul Stamets, Andrew Wild. They weren't in the room with us, but they were in the nearby cabins. It's an old growth forest, incredibly beautiful. Dripping rain. It was drizzly. And so it was, the set and setting was critical to what we had done. And the safety backup was there in spades. There were a number of medical doctors there, as well as, all the leading mushroom and entheogenic mushroom researchers were present at this conference. When I was back there, and there was not another one of these annual conferences after that. That was 1985 or 86. Until 1999, we had a reunion conference. Paul Stamets put it on. And Ken Kesey came, and he brought the bus, the magic bus. Yeah. And the Merry Pranksters were there. Ken and I were the 2 honored guests. And we sat there in between sets. I played with his band that night. And in between sets, Ken and I would just sit and chat, about how he'd gotten, when he was part of the CIA drug experiments in the 60s, how he'd gotten the keys to the cabinets and started his own psychedelic trips that lasted the rest of his life. I did get to meet Albert Hoffman. Wow. I did get to meet R. Gordon Wasson. And they weren't at that particular conference, but I saw them at others. But there were people from all over the world at this one in 1999. And it was filmed. And I understand that last spring, Netflix bought the rights to the footage, which has never been edited. Oh. And so someday it might be on Netflix.
I will be looking for that.
Yeah, but I did not touch mushrooms at that event. I just observed. And the thing that I observed that's very notable, I think, is how peaceful, how quiet, how different it was from being in a bar where people are drinking and violent and dangerous. It was a very, very caring, very, very relaxed, very special. I didn't need any mushrooms. I didn't want any mushrooms. But I guided some people that night and looked after them.
That's really incredible. It's such a different type of, it makes you, I think, feel a sense of not just belonging, but a sense of awe and wonder at what an experience like that can mean for so many people at the same time, as opposed to, what we seek out as self-medication on a daily basis. There's this completely different, much more restorative quality to an experience like that.
Right.
And it's really, really incredible that you got to do that with especially all of those amazing people. I would love just to give you the opportunity to talk about what you established at Evergreen with your program and what the students in that program did scientifically and, in the world. You've mentored some of the world's most known mycologists and others. And I would just love for you to share what you're most proud of about that program that you established at Evergreen, and anything you'd care to say about any of those people.
Which one?
I know.
I mean, one of the programs I'm most proud of, in addition to the Ecology and Chemistry of Pollution program, which was that 8-quarter-long program, where not only did we do the work on DDT, we investigated the effects of heavy metals on areas around Kellogg, Idaho, the effects of heavy metals around the Asarco smelter in Tacoma, and eventually provided the work that got that smelter shut down and removed. Investigated the effect of PCBs on marine mammals. And that research is still going on. It led to the formation of the Cascadia Research Collective by John Calamakitis, who was one of our students. Originally, a lot of our students became part of that, but now it's been a long time. That was formed in about 1980, but they're still going strong, still researching and trying to figure out how to preserve marine mammals. And other students were looking at the effects of fluorides from the aluminum smelters along the Columbia River and effect on vegetational communities. I don't think the smelters are gone now because of our work. They're gone because it was cheaper to go to make the aluminum in Brazil and Argentina than it was to continue to make it here. But yeah, there was a lot of interesting stuff that came out of that. But then there was a program. It was for a core program, i.e. for freshmen, their first program. And the title was Humans and Nature in the Pacific Northwest. And we started with Native American culture. And it's the largest program ever taught in the history of Evergreen. There were 5 faculty on the team and 120 students in the program. But we started with a week-long field trip around the Olympic Peninsula. And part of it was 2 nights on the Makah Indian Reservation, where we had dinner, salmon dinner, planked salmon, or a traditional cooked dinner, and then the next day they did a potlatch. And the students didn't understand what a potlatch was because they were actually offended that I was giving all these people money after they would speak or sing, but that's what a potlatch is. It's a great giveaway. After the chief has been a chief for so many years, you would throw a potlatch, and that chief would become the poorest person in the village because he would have given away everything. And then the next chief would come. And so the tradition of the potlatch was really important, but we looked at Native American agriculture. And just a couple of weeks ago, I found for the first time this wild cranberry bog in Gifford Pinchot National Forest at 3,000 foot elevation. And I walked around in that bog in my muck boots, and it was almost uniformly about 6 inches deep in water. And I knew this is not a natural bog. It was about 40 acres. It was developed by the Native Americans as part of their agriculture. But as this program, Humans and Nature in the Pacific Northwest, we didn't start with the arrival of the white folks. We started with the arrival of the Native Americans and how they lived. And then we looked at geology. We happened to be at the John Day River at a camp on the day the Rajneeshis were voting to disincorporate and form the town of Rajneeshpuram.
Oh my goodness.
In those days, I wore bright purple or bright red shirts, and I was in the field studying fossils with my class when a group of armed farmers came by thinking I was a Rajneeshi wanting to buy more land. I did not know what all those helicopters were about. Those were news reporters from all over. 5 or 6 years later, I visited the Big Muddy Ranch and worked with the woman who tried to poison all the leaders in the Dows. And we drove in, and I drove past these pillboxes with people standing with machine guns. And they kept us at the ranch. This was just a month or two before the whole thing collapsed.
Oh, my goodness.
So I'm there with my students, and I wasn't sure we'd get out alive. And all of us had to line up at the end before they let us go back to our camp for dinner, as the Rajneesh drove by in his Rolls Royce. There was 2 Mercedes-Benz full of machine gun men in front of him, 2 more behind him, and he drives by, and he passed each of us about a foot from us, just with this wave, just slowly driving by this whole line. And after he'd done that, we were allowed to leave. But I wasn't sure.
Right.
I was at that point terrified.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you must have some kind of, I mean, and the Pacific Northwest is sort of riddled with characters like you who have just happened to be in whatever place when all this crazy stuff went down. We have a special brand of weird cosmic energy out here.
So, but it was my ecological agriculture students. There was one other faculty member, and we were there because they had this big festival in July in the Oregon high desert, and they wanted to have corn, tomatoes, the full, and so they had these massive greenhouses, this huge organic grow operation. We went to see what they were doing and how they did it. It was quite an impressive operation and a beautiful, beautiful facility, but very scary at the same time. The total devotion of these people, and to be working. I did not yet, the poisoning in the Dows had already occurred, but it hadn't been connected with the woman I was working with to set up this trip.
That is so creepy. It's so cool.
Yeah, so that's my farming. That's part of it. So the other part is the ecological agriculture program, where we would visit various communes in Oregon and Washington, visit permaculture establishments. I modeled my farm here after permaculture, much to my dismay. I don't have any use for that. I believe in agroforestry, but permaculture is a pyramid scheme. And I have never met anyone who operated a financially successful or agriculturally successful permaculture farm in the Northwest.
But they look
make
really
their
cool.
money off of people coming and paying to be there and experience permaculture. Oh. And the head of it tried to get an appointment at Evergreen when I was a dean. And so I was able to make sure that didn't happen. From Australia. He wanted to come from Australia for a year. But I knew about his reputation with young females.
Oh, dear.
And alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
So I made sure it didn't happen.
That's amazing. What a crazy story you have. And I bet you are the life of the party. Do you, when you think about, just what you've been a part of in your career, in the field of mycology, in the field of environmental chemistry, in the field of agroecology, what is most exciting to you about, when you can sort of shift away from your more pessimistic thoughts, what makes you excited? What makes you hopeful?
The potential, if we can get people to listen. I think there is still a little bit of time, but there's very, very little. I was concerned about the population when The Population Bomb was written in the 1970s and published then. And it's growing rapidly. When the average age in a country is 18, 19 years old, that's not a good scenario. But There are a growing number of people trying to change it. I wished I could figure out how to get more rural people to understand. It's a hard life making your living on the land, and I understand that part of it. But how do you build a sustainable society? And our efforts to try and do that. But yeah, I have looked at it from so many different angles, from the energy angle, the population angle, the ecological angle, the fungal angle. I mean, I'm in love with fungi. I mean, I spend most of my time now dealing with fungi. But sustainable design, everything, trying to figure out a sustainable society. And the most important thing about that is a society can be very, very poor, but as long as there's equity, it can be very prosperous and people can be very happy. But when there are high degrees of inequity, even when a society is rich, the population is not going to be happy. And so one of my biggest concerns about this country is how much the inequity has grown. When I started my career, there was an idea that the top person, should earn a lot more than the person at the bottom, but not thousands of times more. And it was in the 80s that they began, that salaries and incomes were set not by boards they were set by boards of directors. How do you get to be a board of director? You had a company. So you all of a sudden you got the wolf watching the hen house, and they've just taken all the pie for themselves. And so equity is really at the core of what I think we need to achieve. And if we've got more equity, we'll be able to do a better job of all these other things that I care about.
It's very well put. I'm so glad you referenced the population bomb. When I was in high school, I had a biology teacher, very eccentric, and I think I was the only one who liked her, but I loved her. And she gave me that book, and I became a militant negative population growth devotee. But one of the things that really was born in me with that whole experience was just what you say, that concept that even especially in very rich societies where the disparity between rich and poor is its greatest, the concept of enough is lost. I mean, it just doesn't exist anymore. It evaporates. Whereas in a overall, quote unquote, poorer society where there is more equity, that sense of abundance is kind of built in when everybody's needs are being met, but you don't have that feeling like you need to scrape and fight for what's yours. So I love that you end on that. Is there anything that you wish I had asked that I didn't?
We've covered a lot of ground.
We sure have.
And I can talk on and on. I have so many tales, but it's probably best to wrap it up. I could talk about my very first job 2 weeks out of high school, when I walked into Boeing and took their exam, and they'd never seen a perfect score before. And I wind up working on the first supersonic surface-to-air missile.
This is right out of high school?
2 weeks after graduation. Halfway through college, I was disarming nuclear warheads on live Minuteman missiles in their silos. That's my summer job as a college student.
What'd you get paid for that?
A lot.
Oh, okay, good. was going to say, was that like a minimum wage situation?
No, it was more than the current minimum wage in most states in this country.
Wow. That's amazing.
Well, I shouldn't say not most states, in southern states in this country, because the minimum wage is still like $7.50 an hour.
Yeah.
And the Republicans think that's just fine. That's why I'm not a Republican. I don't think $7.50 an hour is enough. And I was making that and a little bit more. I was making probably about $8 an hour, but that's with overtime because I was working 12 hours days.
So disarming nuclear warheads.
Yeah, because we get paid from the time we showed up at the Air Force Base until the time we got back to the base. And so there's the driving time, and some of these sites were fairly far out. So I averaged out, and then I got extra money because I was in the field,
Just your run-of-the-mill summer job there,
just
folks.
my run-of-the-mill summer job.
Yeah. In the life of Dr. Michael Beug. Wow. Well, I hope that I will at least have the opportunity to hear more of your tales someday. And I want to be respectful of your time. So we'll let you go reluctantly today. But thank you so much for joining me today. But also thank you so much for the work that you've done and the people that you've brought into, the various fields that you've worked in. And I look forward to seeing what you do in your next chapter.
Thank you, Mimi.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Take care.
Well, thanks for buying the ticket and taking the ride with me today, people. I think it's probably wise for me to say again, advice is like mushrooms. The wrong kind can be fatal. And none of what you heard today on the podcast constitutes any sort of encouragement on embarking on any type of psychedelic journey of your own. I'm just a humble country doctor, and I don't have the bona fides to be advising anybody in that category. And yet, I feel as though we all were treated to a nearly psychedelic experience vicariously through the presence of our wonderful guest, Dr. Michael Beug, and I am so grateful to him for his time today. I feel like I really only basically saw the very, very tip of the gigantic iceberg that has been his life and career. And I really hope someday to be able to sit with him for a much longer period of time and hear more of his awesome stories. That was just such a treat. So again, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you to the No-Till Market Garden podcast for lending me some airspace again. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here, just jumping in real quick to catch you up on some of what we have going on. Have you filled out the survey yet? That should be up for just a little while longer, but we need as many respondents as possible. This survey will help us get more research dedicated to small-scale ecological growers like yourself. You can find the survey details in the show notes or at our Instagram or website or basically everywhere we can put it. Also, our No-Till Growers YouTube channel is back up and running and jamming again for another season of videos. There are new guides for onion and spinach production, a row cover buying guide over there, a seed priming primer, an essential guide to market garden tools, so many more things. Go over to YouTube and search for No-Till Growers and subscribe. Also, the No-Till Growers Forum is just absolutely booming with so much good nerdy info. It's free. It's awesome. Go check it out at no-tillgrowers.com. If you'd like to support our work or support the idea of keeping farming information free in general, you can pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook at no-tillgrowers.com or one of the no-till hats, which are back in stock. We've got merch there as well. The proceeds from all of those sales at no-tillgrowers.com go to supporting our work. If it's benefited you and you have the means to pitch in, that would be rad. or even better, become a yearly or monthly patron at patreon.com/no-till-growers, where not only may you get discounts on our stuff, but at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Closter Farm and Livestock Co., Sean at All About the Garden, Bill Altman, Ian at Grindstone Farms, Stephen Smith, and Oh Hi Roots. Huge shout out to everyone who supports our show in whatever way that you can. That Patreon page, of course, is the lifeblood of our work, so we hope you will hop on board. And that's it from me. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you next week. Bye.